There will be tons of clips in today's episode, and we'll open with a montage of a few clips that set the tone, that set the point of discussion, and that will allow me to, set a few things straight and maybe help you look at subtext in a different way from what you might have thought so far. Have some fun.
Why do I always have to be the one trying to make this work?
I don't want to do this right now.
You can't just keep ignoring this. What are we gonna do?
Andrea, I don't know. I don't know.
We have to figure out something. We have a kid.
What do you want me to do?
I want you to try.
Seriously? You do this every damn time we talk. I'm done.
This is a Garth Marenghi's Dark Place movie. Like, I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards. At multiple times throughout the movie, characters just straight up say exactly like... Oh my God.
The water.
I still haven't had a glass of water. Wait a minute, it is the water. Don't drink that! Look, it's bright green!
Thank God I only took a tiny sip.
There's that line, thank God I only took a tiny sip. And if you take a tiny sip of this, you're all right.
I know writers who use subtext and they're all cowards. Okay? What I was asking in that scene is, what if politicians continue to pay doctors peanuts? Could they literally turn into monkeys? And no one's asked that before.
From Marenghi's Dark Place, subtext seems to be a bad thing, but this is satire, so you gotta flip it, and we do need subtext. Many people would have said that the first two clips you saw are from films that were lacking subtext and for that reason failed. I would look at it differently. I think they were just bad films. They were not properly executed, and there the dialogue was on the nose and the visual storytelling was direct. It was not indirect, and it was probably also poorly performed. I don't think you can blame subtext for that. When the scene is about what the scene is about, in the words of Robert McKee. What he meant by that is when there's only one layer of meaning, when what you see is what you get. And when you dig through it, there's nothing underneath. Now, the reason subtext is important and the reason we need to communicate things indirectly is because that's exactly what we do in the real world. We communicate the most important things indirectly. We don't say them. They come through our speech and subtext. They come through our body language. I read once that 87% of everything we communicate, actually we communicate unconsciously. So we don't even know that we're saying the things we're saying. In film, we go by putting this in a secondary layer. So on the surface layer, we have something that the audience can relate to that is often dramatic, but underneath something else is going on. And it is a secondary layer that you need to write in as such. In many cases, you'll write your first draft with having just that one surface layer, and then later you go on and you look at the scenes again and you see how you can layer in the additional subtext. But you have to make sure that there is the surface layer first. Let's have a look at a scene that clearly illustrates these two layers. On the surface, we're talking about wine. Underneath, we're talking about something else.
Just to be clear, I'm a red wine drinker.
That's fine.
Okay, cool. But I only drink red wine.
Okay.
And up until last night, I was under the impression that you too only drank red wine. But I guess I was wrong.
I see where you're going with this. I do drink red wine. but I also drink white wine. And I've been known to sample the occasional rosé. And a couple summers back, I tried a Merlot that used to be a Chardonnay, which got a bit complicated.
Okay, yeah, so you're just really open to all wines.
I like the wine and not the label. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. This is just very new to me, so as long as you didn't roll over and cry yourself to sleep with regret, then we're good, right?
No, I absolutely did that. Just wept for hours in the dark. I say we go with this one, it's the biggest.
In this case, the subtext was pretty essential. If you missed it, I think you missed the point of the whole scene. There were two layers here. They were talking about wine, and we saw the wine, so that was plausible. But what this scene was really about was gender preferences. And in that respect, this is a great example of McKee's saying that if the scene is about what the scene is about, well, in this case, it was not what the scene is about. We have another example later in our masterclass that shows us subtext maybe somewhat more subtle, also relating to wine. Now, if in our real lives we speak through indirect communication and we use subtext to get our point across, what would the world look like if there were no such thing and people would say exactly what they think and what they feel? It's an interesting experiment, and effectively Ricky Gervais did that experiment in his film The Invention of Lying. Let's have a clip.
Tell me something about you, though.
You already know a lot about me. You know I'm good looking because, well, here I am. And you know that I'm successful because you've seen my apartment and the clothes that I'm wearing. And you know I'm happy because I'm smiling.
Are you always happy?
Usually. Some days I stay in bed eating and crying.
There you go. Thank you. I had a little sip of this from right there. So, you guys ready to order, or do you need a moment? I'm good.
Oh, I'll have the Caesar salad with chicken because I think I'm fat, but I also think I deserve something that tastes good.
I'll have the fish tacos because it's what I had last time I was here. It's all I know. Great. I'll get those two started. If I gave you my number, would you call me?
No.
I'm going to give you an example where some people would call the scene being an example of subtext, but I think it doesn't stand our test. And I want you to try and figure out why that is. This is from the show The Wire, a show that is very well known for its swearing. So I apologize for the swearing that is to follow, but it's just an essential part of how the characters and how the demographic of this show speaks. And that's important to know, and also to understand why it works. So let's have a look at the scene.
In a sense.
What you need to know is these two detectives are revisiting the scene of a crime a long time after because some things didn't add up.
Fuck.
And they're trying to now figure it out.
Motherfucker.
So they're kind of reconstructing the crime. There is absolutely no subtext here because the scene is about what the scene is about. The dialogue doesn't express what it is about. So as a joke, they've replaced all the dialogue with the swearing, and they are now telling the story visually and just with non-verbal, because you can hardly argue that the swearing is verbal communication. So they're telling the story non-verbally and visually, but there's only one layer, and that layer is exactly what you guys picked up on, is the finding out that there were errors made, and the report that they filed was incorrect. But there is no subtext. So this is not a good example of subtext because it doesn't follow our rule. There's only one layer, and the layer is about the reconstruction of the scene. Is that clear?
Yes.
So then let's go back to that scene we just watched from Schitt's Creek where they were talking about wine. There were two layers there because on the surface layer, they were talking about wine. And what he said about wine might well be the truth. So he may well drink those wines in the way and with the delight that he describes, but then underneath there's another layer. Let's have a look at this clip from the Billy Wilder film Double Indemnity, and we're going to try and see if there are two layers or just one.
How do you do, Mr. Dietrichson? I'm Walter Neff, Pacific All Risk.
Pacific All what?
The Pacific All Risk Insurance Company. It's about some renewals on the automobiles. I've been trying to contact your husband for the past 2 weeks, but he's never in his office.
Is there anything I can do?
The insurance ran out on the 15th. I'd hate to think of you having a smashed fender or something while you're not fully covered.
Perhaps I know what you mean, Mr. Neff. I've just been taking a sunbath.
No pigeons around, I hope. Now, about those policies, Mr. Dietrichson, I hate to take up your time, but...
Oh, that's all right. If you wait till I put something on, I'll be right down. Nettie, show Mr. Neff into the living room.
The first time he said, while you're not fully covered, he was talking about insurance and then brought that pun from subtext into the text. And now it becomes a seduction scene. And she's responding to that. So there is clear interplay. So the subtext is that these two, there is a spark, something is going on, and she wants to continue the conversation. So you'll see that while the conversation about insurance is to a degree real, the seduction kind of comes up from the subtext and becomes the text of the scene. And that becomes stronger and clearer in the next example.
Why don't you drop by tomorrow evening around 8:30? He'll be in then.
Who?
My husband. You were anxious to talk to him, weren't you?
Yeah, I was, but I'm sort of getting over the idea, if you know what I mean.
There's a speed limit in this state, Mr. Neff. 45 miles an hour.
How fast was I going, officer?
I'd say around 90.
Suppose you get down off your motorcycle and give me a ticket.
Suppose I let you off with a warning this time.
Suppose it doesn't take.
Suppose I have to whack you over the knuckles.
Suppose I bust out crying and put my head on your shoulder.
Suppose you try putting it on my husband's shoulder.
That tears it. $8:30 tomorrow evening, then.
That's what I suggested.
Will you be here, too?
I guess so. I usually am.
Same chair, same perfume, same anklet?
I wonder if I know what you mean.
I wonder if you wonder.
That's brilliant dialogue written by Billy Wilder that's constantly navigating between the subtextual and the textual level, or bringing the seduction to the text and pushing it back in the subtext as they navigate what is acceptable in terms of the norms. Now, the subtext here is not just in the dialogue. Obviously, that's one element, but you could also see from their looks that there was non-verbal behavior that supported that subtext. The way they were walking very close to one another, actually touched each other as they were walking to the door. When you write a scene like that, it's really important to be aware of what is on the surface and what is not. It's that interplay that is really sophisticated and gives the viewers incredible pleasure. And you know, when she was talking about when he comes home and he pretends he doesn't know who she's talking about, that is a subtextual signal, say that he doesn't want her to talk about her husband, because in his mind, the two of them are already together. So that is subtext. And then she responds to that by bringing the subtext to the surface. Because when she starts talking about the speed limit has absolutely nothing to do with the talk about insurance or the talk about the text. It has only to do with the way he's coming on to her and the whole seduction process. So that becomes now the topic of their conversation. And she just addresses it indirectly, which makes it more interesting. She could have addressed that directly. It would still only be a single layer. It would just be about the seduction. but Wilder decides to use the metaphor of the speed limit. So when you write dialogue, keep all those tools in mind. That enlivens the dialogue and makes it fun for the viewers to place themselves in the minds and in the shoes of the characters. So what we saw here was a type of subtext that's called innuendo. It is a verbal type of subtext. It often reinforces what is going on in the scene. It is conscious because the characters here, they know full well what they're talking about, although they pretend they don't. And it comes from the character, so it's driven by the character. The next example of subtext is probably less conscious. It's not innuendo, but it is still verbal subtext. This is the opening dialogue from Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen.
I mean, this is unbelievable. Look at this. There's no city like this in the world. There never was.
You act like you've never been here before.
I don't get here often enough. That's the problem. Can you picture how drop-dead gorgeous this city is in the rain? Imagine this town in the 20s, Paris in the 20s. In the rain, the artists and writers.
Why does every city have to be in the rain? What's wonderful about getting wet?
I mean, could you ever picture us maybe moving here after we're married?
Oh, God, no. I could never live out of the United States.
You know, if I'd stayed here and written novels and not gotten, caught up in that just grinding out movie scripts, I'll tell you something, I would drop the house in Beverly Hills, the pool, everything in a second.
So he's a dreamer and she shuts him down. And guess what? They're going to get married. The subtext here is that there may be problems on the horizon for these two because clearly they're not on the same wavelength, and the film will confirm that. Sorry to spoil it for you. So this subtext is verbal subtext. It is, in a way, foreshadowing. It comes from the character, and at the same time it's also relating to the theme. Now, a great example that many of you will know from television of thematic subtext sits in the pilot episode of Breaking Bad.
Chemistry is the study of matter, but I prefer to see it as the study of change. Now, just think about this. Electrons, they change their energy levels. Molecules change their bonds. Huh? Elements, they combine and change into compounds. Well, that's all of life, right? I mean, it's the constant, it's the cycle, it's solution, dissolution, just over and over and over. It is growth, then decay, then transformation. It is fascinating, really.
If the scene is about what the scene is about, Robert McKee said, on the surface, this scene is about Walter White. We're being introduced into his everyday life. He's a chemistry teacher. He's passionate about what he does, but that is not reflected back by the students. So he's not getting that enjoyment from the job that he deserves. And that's important for what's to follow. The subtext here is in his description of what chemistry really is. In the screenplay, it looks like this. So when the student says chemicals, Walt immediately responds, chemicals, no, change. Instead of saying it's a study of matter, he immediately goes into change because that is the core of the subtext here. Subtext is again foreshadowing. He's talking about himself, although he may not, he does not realize at this point. We, the viewers, will realize by the end of this episode when we see the first change in this character. But at this point, it is thematic subtext that indicates what's going to happen with the character. So it is verbal subtext, comes from the character. It is unconscious. In the show, Walter White changes from what the creator calls Mr. Chips to a Scarface. So massive, massive transformation. And the word transformation is used here. Growth, decay. We know how, those of you who've watched the show know how he ends. And that is the core of this scene. That is what this scene is really about. And it is foreshadowing the essence of the show. Now, interestingly, right after this scene, there was a scene in the screenplay where Walt is sitting in the faculty workroom and he's marking. and a colleague walks in, and there seems to be some chemistry going on in the other sense of the word. As it is described here, she's 30s, redhead, attractive without being pretty, sexy more like. And then the next description, Walt stares at her back a little too long, we feel his interest. That scene was not shot because that would have carried subtext that would run ahead to his change. That's not the character that he is at the beginning. So that would have been non-verbal subtext, but it would have contradicted what we need for this part of the story. What is left in the show is this scene, which is much shorter, and it feels a little bit lost. There's not much going on, and you wonder why didn't they cut it out altogether. So not only is the thematic subtext unconscious to the character in this case, sometimes it's unconscious to the writer. And then later, when reviewing the story, you may realize that what the viewer may understand from this scene is actually not what you want to achieve. So it is not always unconscious just to the character, but even to the writer. Thematic subtext is usually a comment on the full story, not just the scene. It is often related to the character arc, and it is definitely not what the scene is about. So in the case of thematic subtext, the scene is about something else, and the subtext then relates to the broader story. The clip that was suggested by a student yesterday that you're going to watch right now is from the film Sideways. Interesting here, I don't think the character is aware of the subtext. I think he's genuinely answering the question, but you can indeed also assume that what he says about wine, again, can be said about himself.
Can I ask you a personal question, Miles?
Sure.
Why are you so into Pinot? I mean, it's like a thing with you.
I don't know. It's a hard grape to grow, as you know, right? It's thin-skinned, temperamental, ripens early. It's not a survivor like Cabernet, which can just grow anywhere and thrive even when it's neglected. No, Pinot needs constant care and attention.
If you were to look at this scene in isolation from the whole film, then you could say, well, he's just talking about wine. It's not immediately obviously clear that this could be about him. There is one hint, though, when she asks the question, and she says, can I ask you a personal question? The personal is, again, a subliminal, a subtextual hint that it is about him. It's about the person. It's not about the topic. Often, in the course of a story, subtext later becomes the text. We just saw the clip from the first episode, the pilot episode of Breaking Bad. The next scene comes from season 3, where we are well advanced, and now the subtext has become part of the actual dialogue.
Anyway, so for me, that's been the biggest wake-up call. Letting go, giving up control. It's like they say, man plans and God laughs.
That is such bullshit.
Excuse me?
Never give up control. Live life on your own terms.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. But cancer's cancer, so...
To hell with your cancer. I've been living with cancer for the better part of a year. Right from the start, it's a death sentence. That's what they keep telling me. Well, guess what? Every life comes with a death sentence.
So there you go. That's the Walter White after a few seasons, and he's now changed. He has transformed, not just by character and behavior, but also visually, the way he looks. We're going to a great film called Phone Booth, a contained thriller, and here's a clear example of thematic subtext that is not part of the character. It is what I would call complex subtext. And could be one of many, many elements that are outside of the character themselves.
Where are you?
There are hundreds of windows out there. Why don't you check them out?
Yeah? So what am I doing now?
You're scratching your head. Now you're brushing your hair back.
So the signs in the window he didn't put them up. He's got nothing to do with that shop. They just happen to be there, and they just happen to make a comment on the theme of the film. What is the theme? The theme is the character journey universalized. So if you were to make a statement about the theme of the film, it would be about how this character transforms, but then in a broader perspective. He is arrogant, he's self-centered, he's selfish, he's rude, and this is something you say to such a character. Who do you think you are? And he will have to redeem himself, and that comes into the dialogue on the surface with this character that calls him in this phone booth. To go back to thematic subtext, what are the traits or the characteristics? Often it is unconscious. It's not always scripted. It's often complex, which means it's outside the character and can be a whole range of elements in addition to just verbal or non-verbal. And thematic subtext is optional. What it means is that if you were to remove it from the scene would still work. So if there would be something else in that window, nobody would have a problem with that. A few minutes later in the same film, we have a good example of dramatic subtext. And you'll see that is very different, although it is still subtext, because in the text of the film at this point, our main character is trying to figure out what's going on with him and who this character is on the other side of the phone. So what we're going to see as subtext is not directly part of that, but it is making a comment that has an impact on how the film progresses. Let's have a look.
Who's Stu? I don't know any Stu.
Why do you prefer Stuart?
Look, a lot of people in this neighborhood know who I am.
Stuart Shepard, 1326 West 51st Street, 3rd floor front.
Go mind fuck some other guy, pal.
I know Pamela McFadden, too. It's not in your best interest to disconnect me. Someone could get hurt. Oh, what's the matter, Stu?
The reason why this is important, it is a structural element in the story. This closing of the door signals that he's now taking the situation seriously. It signals the end of sequence A. It is the call to adventure. It is subtext because if I were to ask you what happened in the scene, you might have leave that out. You may not mention that it's the closing of the door, but if you look at the bigger picture of this film, that moment is still relevant. At the same time, he is focused on the character on the other side of the line. So he may not be consciously aware that he is closing the door. So it's a dramatic subtextual element. Back to thematic subtext, this is Jaws, and I'm going to show you how thematic subtext is often hidden, and people are not aware of it, often not even after watching the film. They may not even be aware what the theme of the film is because they didn't pick up consciously on these hints. Here's the first hint in Jaws about what the theme may be.
Mom, I got cut. I got hit by a vampire.
You guys were playing on those swings. Those swings are dangerous. Stay off there. I haven't fixed them yet.
I think you're gonna live.
The swings are dangerous. I haven't fixed them yet. So Dad has not taken his responsibility. I've got difficulty with that word. Dad has not taken his responsibility, and as a result, son has a bleeding hand. That has nothing to do, seemingly, with the shark that's swimming around, although miraculously the phone call here is going to be just about that. What we have here is thematic foreshadowing. This is the behavior of this character, and it shows us what the outcome of that behavior is. If you don't deal with the root of the problem will persist. He has not dealt with the root of the problem with the swings. Son has bleeding hands. He's not going to deal with the root of the problem in terms of the shark until the midpoint reversal. In the meantime, people will die. Very, very few people will have picked up on that, and indeed very few people see that that is the theme of the film. Many people say it's about someone who's afraid of the water and overcomes that fear. It's part of it, but it's not the core theme. We have another scene in the show that confirms what the real theme is. It is again an example of thematic subtext, and if you were to open the screenplay, the script that's available, the draft that's available online, which is not a shooting draft, you'll find even more examples of scenes that support that idea that we have a character here who's not taking his responsibility. So let's jump all the way to the midpoint reversal of Jaws, where if you listen carefully, he is essentially again saying that he has not taken responsibility with the fireplace in the den. It's dangerous. Don't use it.
Don't use the fireplace in the den because I
What
haven't
am I
fixed
going
the
to tell
flue
the
yet.
kids?
Tell them I'm going fishing.
So it's thrown in there very subtly. Doesn't take a lot of screen time, but it plants itself in our minds. And all these little bits ultimately picture the painting of a character who is lacking responsibility. And that's what this film is about. This page, this is the opening of Little Miss Sunshine, and it describes the opening scene with Richard in a classroom having a lecture about his 9-step program. And in his dialogue, he says, one thing you take away from the 9 weeks we've spent should be this: winners and losers, what's the difference? And I'm going to skip all the way to the bottom of his dialogue, where he says, I want you to go out into the world and be winners. So that's the opening of Little Miss Sunshine. Now, let's see if you can detect some subtext in there.
Inside each and every one of you, at the very core of your being, is a winner waiting to be awakened and unleashed upon the world. With my 9-step Refuse to Lose program, you now have the necessary tools and the insights and the know-how to put your losing habits behind you and to go out and make your dreams come true. No hesitating, no complaining, and no excuses. Now I want you to go out in the world, and I want you to be winners. Thank you. Thank you.
This is Richard at this stage in his life. It's the opening snapshot of who his character is, and it gives us his belief system. And we see that his belief system is not working very well for him because by his own definition, he's a loser. He's not where he wants to be. And he's not happy about that. So he needs to change. Therefore, all these elements together picture where he is now and where he needs to go in the future. This is partially verbal subtext. It's about what he says in contrast to what we see around him. But there's also nonverbal, there's also complex subtext, such as the music. The music underscores that this is not a happy rah-rah moment for anyone, nor the character, nor the viewer. So Little Miss Sunshine, I want to quickly go back to what dramatic subtext means. So what, if we look at the traits, the characteristics of dramatic subtext, that is mostly conscious. It's often scripted, and it is essential because it's part of the progression, the dramatic progression of the film. I'll give you an example that is kind of on the cusp between thematic and dramatic. It carries a bit of both, and this is from Gravity. It is the end of Act 2, where Ryan realizes that she has very, very minimal chances of surviving. She's actually getting ready to die.
That's nice, honey. Go and keep singing just like that. Sing me to sleep and I'll sleep. Keep singing and sing and sing.
In the screenplay, it looks like this. So she leans over, presses a button on the control panel, camera pans with her as she reaches up and switches off the lights. She turns some dials, decreasing the oxygen in the cabin's atmosphere, preparing to kill herself. Now that may not be clear to the viewer. And to make it clear that she's prepared to die, she goes into the corpse pose. She crosses her forearms. That is an example of nonverbal subtext. It is thematic because it has to do with her journey on the way to letting go of the loss of her daughter and learning to live again. This is the end of Act 2, is the lowest point. But it's also dramatic because in this moment we're wondering, is she going to survive or not? That's the dramatic question. So it kind of crosses over, and that makes that moment very powerful. So it is a visual cue that plays on more than just one level. The next example is foreshadowing. Foreshadowing as an example of external or complex subtext. Very small element.
Lunch.
But we get it. He is getting ready for lunch. That's what the scene is about. We think, but then the subtext introduces what's really going to be. He's going to lose his best friend. An example of more complex subtext we see in Citizen Kane. And this is the montage we saw in our masterclass about montages, the breakfast montage. I'm going to show you the first clip and then we'll have a chat about it.
I absolutely adore you.
Oh, Charles, even newspapermen have to sleep.
I'll call Mr. Bernstein, have him put off my appointments until noon.
Most of the subtext here is character subtext. It is verbal and non-verbal. It is in what they say, it's how they behave. They lean in close to one another. They're sitting close to one another. It's the clothes that she's wearing and the look on their face. The second clip,
Do you know how
things have
long you
changed.
kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes? What do you do in a newspaper in the middle of the night?
Emily, my dear, your only correspondent is the Inquirer.
Sometimes I think I'd prefer a rival of flesh and blood.
Oh, Emily, I don't spend that much time on the newspaper.
It isn't just the time. It's what you print. Attacking the president.
You mean Uncle John?
I mean the president of the United States.
He's still Uncle John.
Yesterday's student argued that this may not be an example of subtext because it all pushes the same idea, the fact that these two are growing apart. If you look at it from that perspective, then that's indeed the case. But you could look at the scene in terms of what it is about. It is about what she's reading and what he's doing. And it is only when we see the complete picture of the montage that we realize that there was a lot more information going on and picturing a much broader picture. There are non-personal elements. There are complex subtextual elements that are external to what the characters have contributed, and that is, for instance, the obstacle on the table, that obstructs our view. That's a clear, deliberate, directorial decision. This is not the character deciding, I don't feel close to my husband, so I'm going to put these flowers in between us. This is really an external, complex subtextual element. The music is another example. Complex subtext outside the character, often harder to write, often less effective in the first watching of the film, but it's the type of material that you will discover when you rewatch the film, when you analyze it, and when the film starts to resonate many years after it was made. One of my favorite examples of very subtle, complex subtext is this moment at the end of Act 1 in Toy Story 3. So what you need to know is Woody is leaving his friends. He feels that he needs to be with his master, Andy, because he needs to be there for him when he wants to play with him. And therefore he sacrifices his friendship with the other toys.
Bullseye, no.
That's his worldview. He thinks that's the right thing to do. And then look what happens.
Bullseye.
Here's his
No,
horse.
I said stay.
Bullseye.
Look, I don't want you left alone in the attic, okay? Now stay.
Bonnie?
So what is happening here is that indirectly, in a subtextual way, Woody is communicating that it is not the right thing to do, to follow your master in this way blindly and leaving your friends behind. So Bullseye, in the same way as Woody, is led by his own codependency. He's clinging on to Woody, and Woody knows deep inside that that's not the right thing to do. Yet that's exactly what he is doing right now in the story. So what it signals to us is that on a deeper level, he is aware that this is not the right behavior. So he needs to overcome that sort of behavior. Very subtle subtext, but it works beautifully when we see those two characters. But you only realize what's going on if you ask the question, what is he really doing here? What is Bullseye really wanting? It's the same thing. So he's criticizing Bullseye for doing what exactly he himself is doing at this moment in the story. Beautiful. So complex subtext is often multi-layered. Can be character, can be external, can be dramatic, can be thematic. Great example from Hidden Figures.
You have identification on it?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. We're just on our way to work at Langley. NASA, sir.
We do a great deal of the calculating, getting our rockets into space.
All three of you?
Yes, sir.
Yes, officer.
NASA? That's something. I had no idea they hired.
There are quite a few women working in the space program.
Damn Russians are watching us right now. Sputniks.
It's only subtext if there is a text. What's the text? Dramatically speaking, this scene is about these three women having broken down alongside the road, and they need to get to work. That's what the scene is about. The cop arrives, and the cop's not of any help. He makes things worse. And then the subtext creeps in, which becomes the theme of the film, which is systemic racism in the 1960s in the US. In the screenplay, it looks like this. So there's the ask for identification, and then it feels like the subtext kicks in when he's about to say, I had no idea they hired. He stops himself from saying coloreds or worse. At this point, you could argue that the scene is no longer about breaking down alongside the road. This is about racism and the relationship of this cop to the women. And the subtext goes deeper, it goes further, because when she saves him from embarrassment by jumping in and making it look like he's talking about women, then he's kind of grateful because he didn't want to go there, and he's still embarrassed and he wants to change the subject. And I think that's why he looks up. I don't think he is paranoid not in this situation. He's embarrassed, certainly. And by looking up, he's kind of diverting and diluting and diffusing the tension that occurred in this scene. And then, the scene ends wonderfully as he offers an escort to them to drive to NASA once the car is fixed. It's a great scene that foreshadows the trajectory of these women in the whole film. So it is thematic subtext on more than just one level. I highly recommend you check out that film. I want to give you an overview, so we're almost about to wrap up, of the types of subtext we've looked at today. The most important distinction we've looked at is dramatic versus thematic. We've looked at character versus complex or external, verbal versus nonverbal. One type of subtext is innuendo, another one is foreshadowing. There are many, many other types, and I invite you to watch films and try and detect often recurring types of subtext. And then we ended with complex subtext.
Could there be grounds in saying that as the journey through transformation for the character, there's a generalization from being inauthentic and subtextual to an unconscious, to becoming conscious of fatal flaw and being more conscious and less subtextual at the end of the journey, using something like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day.
There's so many clips I had that I haven't used. Katie knows because she's looked up some of them. Some of them were a bit long. There was a great scene from No Country for Old Men, but one that I would have loved to include was from Groundhog Day, when there's the dialogue between the dudes in the bar when Bill Murray is basically summing up his life, as he says, what would you do when every day you wake up and the same thing happens and you can't do anything about it? And then the other dude says, well, that kind of sums up my life. And it's a funny line, but it is the theme of the film, because it's our lives. What do we do with our lives? We wake up and it feels like we're in that treadmill. So it is a very powerful verbal subtextual statement. But you are absolutely right in saying that there is this trend where the subtext becomes conscious. And very often, in the same way we saw in Breaking Bad in a later season, Walter White is explicitly talking about his own journey, so that now that the issue is on the surface. In many feature films, you will find that the theme is subtextual until around the midpoint reversal, and then you'll have a conversation that addresses it. I may have played the clip from LA Confidential a few months ago, where Russell Crowe's character has a conversation about his journey and his wound. Previously, all that was in his behavior was purely in subtext, but around the midpoint reversal, he speaks it out. In the same in Die Hard, it's not until the end of Act 2 that the character speaks out. Usually, it's the end of Act 2 where that happens. In Phone Booth, the character of Stu realizes what his behavior has been all along, that it was wrong, and he publicly expunges his sins in this speech. So what was subtextual for most of the film comes to the surface around either the midpoint reversal or the end of Act 2. So yeah, that's definitely a good observation.
To speak to that, potentially the mentor is more or less subtextual through the journey of the film as a more conscious figure. And Obi-Wan kind of springs to mind there. I can't remember too much subtext from him.
You can look at it like this. So initially it's dramatic and it becomes thematic. Obi-Wan in the beginning gives Luke the sword. That is a visible dramatic element. But later he says to use the Force. And there's talk about the Force early on, but we don't connect it to Luke in the same way. We don't understand that that's the process he needs to go through, because ultimately he needs to let go as well. So initially it's subtextual for him. He needs to learn the Force, not just by using the sword, but by letting go. And it is in that final moment that Obi-Wan reminds him that it is actually about letting go. And he needs to learn to fly blindly. In The Untouchables with Sean Connery and Kevin Costner, the same thing. Initially, Sean Connery opens the doors for Elliot Ness, or Malone for Elliot Ness. But in his dying moments, he reminds his pupil of the principle. So what has been subtextual, which is all about letting go of the rules and the books and the bureaucracy, now you need to do it the Chicago way. You need to go and change your behavior and do it the Chicago way. So it's become text in that moment.
Does that mean that subtext would usually appear at the beginning of the film?
It's a good point. I haven't looked into that. I think subtext is probably there all along, but probably more in the beginning, because there's more exposition to get across, and it may be that some of that exposition is placed more subtly, so we take it on board subliminally. And then as we progress, it comes more to the surface. That's certainly possible. But I would expect that you'll have some sort of subtext throughout the film, all through to the very end.
Two things. As you know, I'm a trained actor under Hayes Gordon. So we're taught that you're only ever playing the subtext. So the first thing you do is you take the script and then you look at the subtext of the script and then you play the subtext through the script. So that was the first thing that I wanted to comment I wanted to make. And the other question I wanted to ask, which just occurred to me, is the subtext always about matters that society may not want you to address directly?
Yeah, I seen Nandi shake, and I think your instinct is right. I think subtext can be broader than that. I think it often is, because in our everyday communication, we suppress what we feel is not politically correct, and it'll come out in different ways. It'll come out, in body language, because people, it's hard to completely hide your worldviews. You can say something, but people can tell the lie. So you're absolutely right that very often it is a matter of suppressing the real worldview, and then it comes out in subtext. But I think that there are examples of subtext that are somewhat broader. I'm thinking about something my best friend in Belgium, he has always been my mentor when it comes to screenwriting. He's an incredibly smart dude. And you should check out, he's got a website now where someone reads his own text, I think it's his son. It's called Film Dissect. But first you need to subscribe to my channel, of course, and then you go to his. He says, in Chinatown, there is subtext about the dryness of the climate, but also the story. In Chinatown, characters go uphill, characters smoke, characters sweat, but they're not allowed to hydrate. So it's you are being fed this subliminal message that it's high, it's hot, and it's dry, and you subliminally feel with the characters how that climate affects them. So that's not a psychological, it's not a moral thing. Because sometimes I think it's psychological but not moral. And I think if you were to look at Jaws, there may be subtext about Brody's fear of water as well, which, fear of water is not moral, it's just purely psychological. So I think subtext can be a little bit broader than just moral issues. Next week, we're going to talk about tone. That is also going to be a relatively new masterclass. I have addressed it previously for the Accelerator Pod in Canberra, but I'll rework that and bring you new examples and hopefully update it a bit. I hope to see you then. In the meantime, keep it cool this weekend, and have a great week, and see you next time. Bye-bye.